The sun blazed mercilessly across the Arizona desert as Jake Thompson rode his weary horse through the endless expanse of red sand and scattered cacti. Sweat dripped from beneath his worn cowboy hat, and his water canteen had been empty for hours. The veteran cattle rancher had been tracking stolen livestock for 3 days, following faint hoof prints that seemed to disappear and reappear like desert mirages. Jake's horse, a sturdy brown mare named Belle, snorted and shook her head, clearly struggling in the oppressive heat. The cowboy patted her neck gently, knowing they both needed water soon, or they wouldn't survive another day in this wasteland. His throat felt like sandpaper, and his lips were cracked and bleeding. As they crested a small hill, Jake's heart sank. Below them stretched more of the same barren landscape, with no sign of water, shade, or civilization. He was beginning to think he had made a terrible mistake chasing the cattle thieves this far into Apache territory. The local sheriff had warned him about venturing alone into these lands, but Jake's stubborn pride had overruled his common sense. Suddenly, Belle's ears perked up and she whinnied softly. Jake squinted through the heat waves and saw movement in the distance. 3 figures emerged from behind a cluster of large rocks, moving with the fluid grace of desert dwellers. As they came closer, Jake realized they were young Apache women, perhaps in their late teens or early 20s. The cowboy's hand instinctively moved toward his gun, but something stopped him. The 3 women showed no signs of hostility. Instead, they approached with calm confidence, their dark eyes studying him with curiosity rather than fear. Each wore traditional Apache clothing, and Jake noticed intricate markings on their faces and arms, geometric patterns and symbols that seemed to tell a story he couldn't understand. The tallest of the 3, with long braided hair adorned with small feathers, stepped forward. She spoke in accented English, her voice clear despite the desert wind. "You are lost, cowboy. This is not a place for your kind to wander alone." Jake touched the brim of his hat respectfully, though his throat was too dry to speak properly. "Ma'am," he croaked, "I'm tracking stolen cattle. Been riding for days without water." The second woman, whose face bore beautiful painted symbols that resembled lightning bolts, exchanged glances with her companions. She carried a small decorated pot that Jake desperately hoped contained water. The third woman, the youngest, had distinctive markings on her arms that looked like intertwining serpents, and she watched Jake with intelligent, calculating eyes. "Stolen cattle?" the first woman asked, raising an eyebrow. "Many cattle have passed through our lands recently. Men with pale skin and loud voices drove them toward the canyon country." Jake's eyes widened with hope. These women might have seen the thieves he was pursuing, but more immediately, he needed their help to survive. "Please," he whispered, pointing to his empty canteen. "Water?" The 3 women conferred in their native language, their conversation rapid and musical. Jake caught none of the words, but their body language suggested disagreement. The youngest seemed to be arguing against helping him, while the others appeared more sympathetic. Finally, the woman with lightning bolt markings approached and offered Jake her water pot. As he reached for it gratefully, she pulled it back slightly. "You must understand, cowboy, our people and your people have not always been friends. Why should we help you?" Jake lowered his hand and met her gaze directly. Despite his desperate thirst, he recognized the validity of her question. "You're right to be cautious, ma'am. I can't speak for all my people, but I can speak for myself. I'm not here to cause trouble for anyone. I just want to recover what was stolen and get home to my family." The woman with serpent markings stepped closer, studying Jake's face intently. She spoke to her companions again, and this time Jake caught a few words that sounded familiar from his limited interactions with Apache traders in town. She seemed to be noting something about his appearance or manner. "My sister says you have honest eyes," the tall woman translated. but eyes can lie as easily as mouths. Jake nodded slowly. That's true, but I'm asking for your help not because I deserve it, but because I need it. And if I can help you in return, I will. The women exchanged another series of rapid words. The youngest pointed toward the horizon, then made gestures that seemed to indicate danger. The other two nodded gravely. There is something you should know, Cowboy, the first woman said. The men who took your cattle, they are not the only danger in these lands. Other men have come, bad men with many guns. They seek to harm our people and claim our sacred places. Jake's blood chilled. He had heard rumors in town about armed groups moving through the territory, men who showed no respect for Apache lands or people. How many of these bad men? Many, the woman with lightning markings replied. They wear symbols of hate and speak of driving out all who are not like them. They have threatened our village. The youngest woman suddenly spoke urgently in Apache, pointing toward a dust cloud rising in the distance. The others immediately tensed, and Jake felt his heart race as he realized they were all in immediate danger. They come, the tall woman said grimly. We must hide. The four of them moved quickly toward the rocks where the women had first appeared. Jake led Belle behind a large boulder while the three Apache women positioned themselves with practiced efficiency. The dust cloud grew larger, and soon Jake could hear the thundering of hooves and rough voices carried on the desert wind. How many? Jake whispered to the tall woman, whose name he learned was Ayana. Too many for us to fight, she replied quietly, but maybe too few to search everywhere. As the riders approached, Jake peered carefully around the boulder. His stomach dropped when he saw the group, 12 heavily armed men wearing bandanas and carrying enough firepower to level a small town. These weren't ordinary outlaws. They moved with military precision and wore matching symbols on their clothing that Jake recognized as belonging to a notorious hate group that had been terrorizing the territory. The woman with lightning bolt markings, who introduced herself as Kira, touched Jake's arm and pointed to specific riders. Those two, she whispered. They drove your cattle. We saw them yesterday. Jake's jaw tightened as he recognized the men who had stolen his livestock. But now a much bigger problem loomed. The leader of the group, a scarred man with cold eyes, called out commands to spread out and search the area. Someone's been through here recently, the leader shouted. Fresh tracks, could be Apache scouts watching our movements. Ayana's youngest sister, Nayeli, whose serpent markings seemed to shimmer in the shifting light, whispered urgently to her companions. Jake couldn't understand the words, but her tone conveyed extreme concern. What is it? Jake asked quietly. My sister says these men are the ones who burned the trading post at Willow Creek last week, Ayana explained. They killed 3 innocent people, including a child. Jake's blood boiled. He had heard about the Willow Creek massacre but hadn't known who was responsible. These weren't just cattle thieves. They were murderers who targeted anyone who didn't fit their twisted view of who belonged in the territory. The riders began circling the area, getting closer to their hiding spot. Jake realized that if they were discovered, the 3 women would face horrible fates at the hands of these violent men. His hand moved to his gun, but Kira shook her head firmly. 1 gun against 12, she whispered. That is not courage, that is foolishness. But as the riders drew nearer, Jake could see no other option. He was about to draw his weapon when Nayeli grabbed his wrist. She pointed to her arm markings and then to something on the ground near their feet. Following her gaze, Jake saw what appeared to be a small opening between the rocks, barely large enough for a person to squeeze through. Nayeli's serpent markings seemed to point directly toward this hidden passage, as if they were a map. Ayana noticed what her sister was indicating and nodded slowly. The sacred markings, she murmured. They mark the old paths. Jake didn't understand, but when the women began moving toward the opening, he followed. They squeezed through the narrow passage one by one, with Jake bringing Belle behind them. The passage led to a hidden chamber within the rock formation, large enough to conceal all of them comfortably. As they caught their breath in the cool shadows, Ayanna explained in hushed tones. Our markings are not just decoration, Cowboy. They are maps, warnings, and protections passed down through generations. Each pattern tells a story and provides guidance. Kira pointed to her lightning bolt markings. These show the paths of water through the desert. When our people see these marks, they know I can guide them to springs and oases. Nayeli touched the serpent patterns on her arms and spoke in English for the first time. My markings show the hidden places, caves, passages, safe paths through dangerous country. Our grandmother painted these on me when I became a woman. Jake stared in amazement. So you're like living maps of the desert. More than maps, Ayanna said, showing him the geometric patterns on her face. These markings show my clan, my family history, my skills as a healer and negotiator. They tell our people who I am and what I can offer. Outside their hiding place, they could hear the riders searching and cursing. The leader was growing frustrated, shouting orders and threatening his men. Jake realized these women had just saved his life using knowledge that had been preserved for centuries in the form of traditional markings. Why are you helping me? He asked quietly. Your people have every reason to distrust white men, especially with groups like this terrorizing the territory. The three sisters exchanged glances before Ayanna responded. Because good people must help each other, regardless of the color of their skin. My grandmother taught us that hatred only breeds more hatred. The men outside, they hate anyone who is different. We will not let that hatred make us like them. Hours passed before the sound of hooves finally faded into the distance. When they emerged from their hiding place, the sun was setting, painting the desert in brilliant oranges and purples. The riders had given up their search and moved on, but Jake knew they would be back. They're looking for your village, he said to the women. You're not safe. We know, Kira replied grimly. We have been moving our people to the hidden places our ancestors knew. But there are so many who need protection. Elders, children, families with nowhere else to go. Jake made a decision that would change everything. What if I helped you? I know people in town, good people who could stand against these murderers. And I owe you my life. Nayeli studied him carefully, her intelligent eyes seeming to read his very soul. Finally, she spoke again in her careful English. You would fight beside us against your own kind? They're not my kind, Jake said firmly. My kind doesn't murder children or burn down trading posts. My kind doesn't terrorize innocent families. As night fell over the desert, the four of them sat around a small, concealed fire that Kira had built using techniques that produced almost no visible smoke. They shared water and dried meat while planning their next moves. The markings that saved us today, Jake said, looking at each woman in turn. There's more to them than you've told me, isn't there? Ayanna smiled mysteriously. Much more, Cowboy Jake. Tomorrow, you will begin to understand why our ancestors were wiser than anyone realizes. Dawn broke with an urgency that set everyone on edge. Nayeli had awakened before the others, her hand pressed to the ground as if listening to something the earth was telling her. When Jake opened his eyes, she was already speaking rapidly to her sisters in Apache. What is it? Jake asked, instantly alert. The riders split up during the night, Ayanna explained, her face grave. Most went toward our village, but some doubled back. They know we helped you escape yesterday. Kira stood and gathered her water pot, checking the markings on her arms as if consulting a complex map. There is a way to reach our village first, but it is dangerous. The old paths through the canyon country, our ancestors used them to escape enemies long ago. Jake saddled Belle quickly. Lead the way. We need to warn your people. As they set out across the desert, Nayeli began explaining more about their markings. Each symbol connects to others, she said, pointing to a spiral pattern on her forearm. This one shows a hidden water source, but only when you see it with this one. She indicated a small diamond shape near her wrist, which means it flows underground. The knowledge was incredibly complex. Jake realized that what he had initially seen as decorative tattoos were actually a sophisticated information system that had allowed the Apache people to survive in harsh desert conditions for generations. They traveled for hours through terrain that would have been impossible for Jake to navigate alone. Kira's lightning markings guided them to water sources that appeared to be nothing more than dry rock until she showed them where to dig. Nayeli's serpent patterns revealed passages through cliff faces that looked completely solid from a distance. As they climbed through a narrow canyon, Ayana suddenly held up her hand for silence. In the distance, they could hear gunfire and shouting. They were too late. The attack on the village had already begun. "How many people are down there?" Jake asked, looking toward the sound of battle. 40 families, Ayana replied, her voice tight with worry. Many children and elders who cannot fight. Jake studied the canyon walls, thinking hard. An idea began forming in his mind, desperate, but possibly their only chance. "Those markings of yours," he said to Nayeli, "do they show all the hidden passages around your village?" She nodded. "Every path, every cave, every secret way." "Why?" "Because I think I know how to turn the tables on those murderers." Jake explained his plan quickly. The three sisters listened intently, their expressions shifting from skepticism to growing excitement. It was risky and would require perfect timing, but it might save their people. "You would do this?" Kira asked. "Risk your life for people you do not even know?" "Those markings saved my life yesterday," Jake replied. "Now I want to return the favor." They split up according to the plan. Ayana descended toward the village to organize the defense, while Kira used her knowledge of water sources to position herself strategically. Jake and Nayeli made their way to the canyon rim above the attacking riders. From their vantage point, Jake could see the situation below. The heavily armed riders had the village surrounded, but they clearly didn't know the terrain. They were positioned in what they thought were defensive positions, but Nayeli's markings revealed these locations to be traps. "There," Nayeli whispered, pointing to a series of small marks on her arm that resembled falling rocks. "That entire cliff face is unstable. In the old stories, our warriors would cause rock slides to stop enemy attacks." Jake studied the cliff and saw what she meant. Someone with the right knowledge could trigger a controlled avalanche that would block the attacker's escape route without harming the village below. They worked their way along the canyon rim to the critical point. Jake used his rope and his experience as a rancher to secure himself, while Nayeli guided him to exactly the right spots to place charges they had improvised from his rifle cartridges. Below them, the shooting continued, but Jake could see that Ayana had successfully organized the villagers into a defensive formation using the natural rock barriers that the attackers couldn't see. "Now?" Jake asked, his hand on the improvised trigger. Nayeli consulted her markings one more time, reading them like a complex engineering manual. "Now," she confirmed. The explosion echoed through the canyon like thunder. Tons of rock crashed down, creating a natural wall that blocked the attackers' main escape route. But the plan was only half complete. Kira had positioned herself at the water source the attackers were using to rest their horses. As the rock slide forced them to retreat toward her location, she revealed herself and shouted in English, "Your horses need water, but this spring belongs to the Apache people." The confused riders, thinking they faced only a single young woman, charged toward her position. But Kira's lightning markings had guided her to a spot where flash flood channels converged. When she pulled away the rocks she had carefully positioned, water from the spring flowed into ancient channels that created a muddy barrier, trapping several horses and riders. Meanwhile, Ayanna had used her knowledge as a healer to create smoke from desert plants that disoriented the remaining attackers without seriously harming them. The geometric patterns on her face had indicated which plants to use and how to combine them for maximum effect. Within minutes, the seemingly organized attack had become complete chaos. Half the riders were trapped by the rock slide, others were stuck in mud, and the rest were blinded by smoke and confused by the terrain they couldn't read. Jake and Nayeli made their way down to the village, where they found the Apache people had successfully captured most of the attackers. The leader of the group, the scarred man who had terrorized the territory, sat tied up and glaring with impotent rage. "How?" he snarled when he saw Jake. "How did you know our movements?" Jake looked at the three sisters, who stood together with quiet dignity despite having just won an incredible victory. "I had teachers," he said simply, "people who understand this land in ways you never could." Over the next few days, as they waited for the territorial marshal to arrive and collect the prisoners, Jake learned even more about the markings and their meanings. Each pattern told multiple stories: practical information about survival, spiritual beliefs about the connection between people and the land, and historical records of the tribe's experiences. "Our markings are our libraries," Ayanna explained one evening as they sat around a fire in the village center. "White people keep their knowledge in books that can be lost or burned. We keep ours on our bodies in our memories passed from generation to generation." Jake had recovered his stolen cattle, but more importantly, he had gained something much more valuable: an understanding of a culture that had thrived in harsh conditions through wisdom accumulated over centuries. When the marshal finally arrived with a large posse, he was amazed to find all 12 of the notorious raiders captured with minimal violence. "How did you manage this, Thompson?" he asked Jake. Jake gestured toward the three sisters, whose markings caught the firelight beautifully. "I had help from people who know things that books can't teach and maps can't show. These markings," he said, looking at each woman with deep respect, "they didn't just save my life, they saved an entire community." As Jake prepared to return to his ranch, Nayeli approached him with a small pot of paint. "You are friend to our people now," she said. "Will you accept our mark of friendship?" Jake held out his arm, and with careful strokes, she painted a simple but meaningful symbol, a pattern that showed safe passage and welcome among the Apache people. It was his first marking, and though it would fade with time, its meaning would stay with him forever. Years later, Jake would become known throughout the territory as a man who could travel safely through any part of the desert, welcomed by Apache people who recognized the faded but still visible symbol on his arm. He never forgot the lesson he learned that day: that wisdom comes in many forms, and the people who seem most different from us often have the most valuable knowledge to share. The three sisters continued to use their markings to guide and protect their people, and their village became known as a place where Apache and white people could meet in peace and mutual respect. The markings that had once been their saving grace became symbols of hope for a better future, where different cultures could learn from each other instead of fighting. And whenever travelers asked Jake about the faded marking on his arm, he would smile and say, "That's the story of how 3 Apache girls' markings became my saving grace, and taught me that true strength comes not from guns or horses, but from understanding and respecting the wisdom of others."